What if the most devastating defeat for Germany's top officers didn't happen on the battlefield, but in a place no one expected? A remote Canadian prison camp, thousands of miles from the front lines. Imagine this, May 1945, the world is reeling from the final days of World War II. Cities across Europe are in ruins, armies are surrendering, and the Nazi regime is collapsing under the weight of Allied firepower. But for a select group of German officers, the real shock was still waiting for them, far from the chaos of Berlin or the ruins of Hamburg. Their destination? Camp 21, a secretive facility tucked away in the forests of Ontario, Canada. These men were not ordinary soldiers. They were the masterminds of the German war machine, commanders who had led tanks across France, strategists who had calculated every bullet and ration, men who believed they understood the true nature of power. They arrived in Canada expecting hardship, humiliation, and hunger. After all, the rumors had reached even the highest ranks. Allied supply lines were stretched thin, and prisoners of war could expect little more than watery soup and stale bread. In their minds, defeat meant deprivation. But as they stepped through the doors of Camp 21's mess hall, everything they thought they knew was about to be shattered. The air was thick with the smell of roast beef and fresh bread, aromas that hadn't filled their senses in years. Instead of the grim, rationed meals they'd braced for, they found trays piled high with thick slices of meat, creamy mashed potatoes, and vegetables so bright they looked almost unreal. Real butter, real coffee, even dessert. It was a feast that seemed impossible in wartime, especially for prisoners. For these German officers, the shock wasn't just about the food, it was about what the food represented. Back in Germany, their own soldiers were starving, surviving on black bread mixed with sawdust, thin soup, and ersatz coffee made from acorns. The homeland was crumbling, factories were silent, and farms were empty. Yet here in the heart of North America, their captors were serving up abundance as if the war had never touched them. The questions started immediately. Was this some kind of elaborate show for the Red Cross, a propaganda stunt to impress international inspectors? Or was it possible that the Allies, especially Canada with its vast fields and powerful industry, had managed to do what Germany could not, feed not just their own armies but even their enemies without ever running out? As the officers sat down at long wooden tables, surrounded by the easy laughter of Canadian guards, a new kind of fear crept in. If this meal was real, what else had they been wrong about? What if everything they'd been told about Allied weakness was just a myth? What if the true secret to victory wasn't just tanks and guns but something far more powerful, an endless supply of food delivered with quiet confidence? This is the untold story of how a group of defeated German officers discovered the real reason for their downfall, not in the ruins of Europe, but in the unexpected abundance of a Canadian prison camp. And as you'll see, the lessons they learned at Camp 21 would change their lives forever, revealing a side of World War II that most Americans have never heard. To truly understand the shock these German officers felt, you have to see the world they came from and the world they entered. In the final months of World War II, Germany was a nation on the edge of starvation. Allied bombers had turned cities into rubble, railroads into twisted metal, and factories into silent shells. The once mighty German supply system had collapsed under relentless American and Allied attacks. Soldiers at the front lines were lucky to get a crust of bread, let alone a hot meal. Rations had dropped to desperate levels, barely enough calories to keep a man alive, let alone fighting. Black bread was stretched with sawdust, soup was little more than colored water, and real coffee was a distant memory. Even apples and potatoes, once staples of the German diet, had vanished from the tables of both soldiers and civilians. Back home, families waited in bomb shelters, hungry and afraid. Farms had no workers, fields went unplanted, and food shortages became a daily nightmare. The German war machine, once feared across Europe, was running on empty. Every day, more soldiers surrendered not just because of enemy fire but because their bodies simply couldn't go on. The myth of Nazi invincibility was crumbling, not just from the outside but from within. Now imagine stepping out of that world and into the heart of North America. Canada, America's northern neighbor, had become an agricultural powerhouse almost overnight. While Europe starved, Canadian farms exploded with production. Wheat fields stretched for miles, producing hundreds of millions of bushels every year. Meat-packing plants ran day and night, churning out beef, pork, and chicken not just for Canadian troops, but for the armies of the United States, Britain, and even the Soviet Union. The numbers were staggering, enough food to feed millions of soldiers plus civilians and still have plenty left over. But it wasn't just about raw numbers. Canada had built a food system based on science, efficiency, and relentless organization. Military nutritionists designed rotating menus to keep soldiers healthy and strong. Every meal was carefully planned to deliver the calories and vitamins needed for combat. Fresh vegetables, real butter, and even desserts were standard, not luxuries. The Canadian Army Medical Corps enforced strict rules: no shortcuts, no skimping, and no excuses. Good food wasn't just a perk, it was a weapon, as vital as any rifle or tank. For American viewers, this story hits close to home. The United States and Canada worked hand in hand to create a supply chain that stretched from the wheat fields of the Midwest to the battlefields of Europe. American trains carried Canadian grain, American ships delivered Canadian beef, and together the two nations built a logistical network that the Axis powers could only dream of. While German soldiers wasted away, Allied troops marched on full stomachs, powered by the bounty of North America. This contrast was more than just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of survival. The ability to feed armies, prisoners, and entire nations became the hidden front line of World War II. And for the German officers at Camp 21, the realization was devastating. Everything they'd been told about Allied weakness, about shortages and desperation, was exposed as a lie the moment they tasted their first Canadian meal. The shock wasn't just physical, it was psychological. How could a country with only 11 million people, a fraction of Germany's population, produce such abundance? How could they feed not just their own but their allies and even their enemies without ever running out? The answer was simple yet profound: organization, innovation, and the sheer scale of North American resources. As the days passed, the German officers began to see the bigger picture. The war wasn't just lost on the battlefield, it was lost in the fields and factories, in the kitchens and mess halls, in the quiet efficiency of a system that never broke down. The real power of the Allies wasn't just in their weapons, but in their ability to sustain the fight no matter how long it lasted. For the men of Camp 21, this was a revelation that would haunt them for years. The collapse of Germany wasn't just a military defeat, it was a failure of imagination, a refusal to believe that their enemies could outproduce, outlast, and outfeed them at every turn. And as they sat down to another meal, surrounded by the quiet confidence of their Canadian captors, they began to realize just how much they still had to learn. The first meal at Camp 21 was more than just food, it was a psychological ambush. For the German officers, every step into the mess hall felt like crossing into enemy territory all over again. They had survived the chaos of surrender, the uncertainty of capture, and the long journey across the Atlantic. But nothing had prepared them for what they were about to experience in this remote corner of Canada. Picture the scene: a line of battle-hardened officers, men who had commanded tanks and troops across Europe, now standing awkwardly in front of a serving counter. The air was thick with the aroma of roast beef, real coffee, and fresh-baked bread. For American viewers, it's easy to imagine the comfort of a home-cooked meal after a long day, but for these men it was almost surreal. They hadn't seen food like this in years. Their eyes darted from the heaping trays of meat to the golden mashed potatoes, the bright carrots and peas, the soft white bread with real butter melting on top. It was a feast that would have been unthinkable in wartime Germany. But instead of relief, suspicion filled the room. The officers whispered to each other in German, convinced this was all a show. "This must be for the Red Cross," one muttered. "Propaganda portions just for the cameras." Another nodded, certain that tomorrow would bring the real rations: thin soup, stale bread, and just enough to keep them alive. After all, that's what their intelligence reports had always claimed about the Allies, that their supply lines were stretched, their resources running dry, and their strength only a facade. Yet the evidence in front of them was impossible to ignore. The Canadian guards standing along the walls didn't seem tense or watchful. They chatted quietly, laughed with each other, and paid little attention to the spectacle unfolding at the tables. For them, this meal was nothing special, just another day, another dinner. That casual confidence was unsettling. If this was a performance, the actors weren't even trying. As the officers sat down, their skepticism only deepened. Some poked at the roast beef with their forks, half expecting it to be fake. Others sniffed the coffee, searching for the bitter scent of substitutes, but everything was real. The beef was tender, the gravy rich, the vegetables fresh and vibrant. The bread was soft inside, with a golden crust that crumbled perfectly. Even the butter tasted like something from a distant, better world. For American viewers, the idea of food as a weapon might sound strange. But in World War II, nutrition was a battlefield all its own. The United States and Canada had mastered the art of feeding armies, using science, logistics, and sheer determination to keep their troops strong. In contrast, the Axis powers were starving, their soldiers growing weaker by the day. The difference was more than just calories. It was a matter of morale, resilience, and the will to fight. Back in the mess hall, the German officers struggled to process what was happening. One, a former restaurant owner's son, recognized the quality instantly. Another, a logistics expert, began calculating the cost of such a meal, multiplied by hundreds of prisoners 3 times a day. The numbers didn't add up. "This can't last," he whispered. "It's impossible." But as the meal went on, something even more unsettling happened. Hunger overcame suspicion. The youngest officer, who had watched his men starve on the Eastern Front, finally took a bite. His eyes widened in disbelief. "It tastes real," he said quietly, almost afraid to believe it. Around the room, others followed suit. The food was too good to resist, and soon the clatter of forks and quiet conversation filled the hall. Still, the doubts lingered. Was this just a one-time event? Would tomorrow bring the harsh reality they expected? Or was there something deeper at work, something that challenged everything they thought they knew about their enemies? For the German officers at Camp 21, that first meal was the beginning of a journey they never anticipated. It was a lesson in humility, a confrontation with the truth, and a glimpse into the hidden strength of the Allied nations. And for American viewers, it's a reminder that sometimes, the most powerful victories aren't won with guns or tanks, but with the simple act of sharing a meal. As the officers finished their plates, the questions only grew. If this abundance was real, what else had they misunderstood? What other myths had they believed about the Allies, about America, about the very nature of power in wartime? The answers would come meal by meal, day by day, as the reality of Camp 21 slowly unraveled everything they thought they knew. The next morning, the German officers at Camp 21 woke up expecting the illusion to shatter. Surely they thought last night's feast was a one-time show, some elaborate performance for the benefit of outside observers. But as dawn broke over the Canadian wilderness, the truth became impossible to ignore. The mess hall was already alive with the smell of fresh bread and real coffee, the kind of breakfast that had become a distant memory in war-torn Europe. For American viewers, it's easy to take for granted the idea of a hearty breakfast: eggs, bacon, toast, fruit, and hot coffee. But for these German officers, it was almost a miracle. In Germany, even the highest-ranking commanders had grown used to hunger. Their bodies had forgotten what it felt like to be truly full. Yet here in a Canadian prison camp, the portions were generous, the food was real, and the meals arrived like clockwork. Lunch brought more surprises: vegetable soup with crusty bread, cheese sandwiches, cookies, and cold milk. Dinner was another revelation: chicken with roasted potatoes, green beans, and apple crisp for dessert. Each meal was different, each one abundant, and the quality never slipped. The officers waited for the rations to shrink, for the food to turn bland or scarce, but it never happened. Day after day, the abundance continued. This wasn't just a matter of comfort. It was a daily reminder of the vast difference between the Allied and Axis worlds. In Germany, soldiers and civilians alike were scraping by on rations that barely kept them alive. Bread was mixed with sawdust, margarine tasted like candle wax, and coffee was nothing but bitter substitutes. The German supply system had collapsed under the relentless pressure of Allied bombing and resource shortages. Rail lines were destroyed, farms were empty, and factories stood silent. But in North America, the story was completely different. Canada and the United States had built a supply chain that was the envy of the world. Trains arrived at Camp 21 every week, loaded with beef from Alberta, potatoes from New Brunswick, canned vegetables from Ontario, and fresh bread baked right in the camp. Real butter came in blocks, coffee beans were ground daily, and sugar bowls sat on every table. Sometimes there was even chocolate, a luxury that German officers hadn't tasted in years. For American viewers, this is a powerful reminder of the home front's role in winning the war. While U.S. soldiers fought overseas, American and Canadian farmers, factory workers, and railroad crews kept the supply lines moving. The ability to feed not just armies but also prisoners and allies became a secret weapon, one that the Axis powers could never match. As the days passed, the psychological impact on the German officers grew. At first, they clung to their suspicions, convinced that the abundance couldn't last. But as meal after meal arrived, always on time, always plentiful, their doubts began to crumble. Some officers stopped questioning altogether, simply accepting the reality in front of them. Others, like the youngest among them, started to regain color in their faces, their bodies slowly recovering from years of deprivation. The Canadian Guards noticed the change, too. Prisoners who had arrived sullen and suspicious now volunteered for work details, helped clean the camp, and even started conversations with their captors. The rigid lines between enemy and guard began to blur, replaced by a quiet sense of mutual respect. For the first time, the German officers saw their captors not as adversaries but as people who took pride in their work, who believed in treating others with dignity, even in the aftermath of war. This transformation was more than just physical. It was a profound shift in mindset, a breaking down of the propaganda and myths that had shaped the German officers' worldview. Every meal was a lesson in the power of organization, efficiency, and compassion. Every day, the reality of Allied abundance chipped away at the old certainties, forcing the officers to confront the truth. The war had been lost not just on the battlefield, but in the kitchens, farms, and factories of North America. For American viewers, the story of Camp 21 is a testament to the strength of the Allied home front. It's a reminder that victory in World War II was built not just on courage and sacrifice, but on the ability to outproduce, outlast, and outfeed the enemy. The abundance at Camp 21 wasn't just a fluke, it was the result of a system that worked, a society that believed in the power of plenty. As the days turned into weeks, the German officers at Camp 21 could no longer deny what they were experiencing. The meals kept coming, the quality never faltered, and the lessons grew deeper with every bite. The reality had set in. They were living proof of a truth that would echo long after the war was over. In the end, it wasn't just the guns and tanks that decided the outcome. It was the relentless, unstoppable abundance of the Allied nations. As the days at Camp 21 unfolded, the German officers began to notice something even more surprising than the endless supply of food: the people behind it. For many Americans, the image of a World War II prison camp conjures up harsh discipline, suspicion, and cold authority. But at this remote Canadian facility, the reality was far more complex and far more human. The camp was run by men like Sergeant Robert Patterson, a battle-hardened veteran from Calgary who had fought alongside American troops in Sicily and Italy. Patterson had seen the worst of war, but he believed in treating prisoners with dignity. His philosophy was simple: well-fed prisoners caused fewer problems, and respect was a two-way street. For American viewers, this echoes the values that shaped the U.S. military's own approach to prisoners of war: firm but fair, and always rooted in a sense of shared humanity. Then there was Corporal Jean-Marie Dubois, the camp's cook. Before the war, Dubois had worked in a Montreal restaurant, perfecting his craft in kitchens that prized flavor and presentation. Now he brought that same pride to the mess hall at Camp 21, cooking for hundreds of enemy officers every day. For Dubois, food was more than just sustenance. It was a way to bridge the gap between enemies, to remind everyone that, at the end of the day, people are people. The German officers couldn't help but notice the difference. In Germany, cooks were often soldiers pressed into service, doing the bare minimum to keep their comrades alive. But Dubois cooked like it mattered, tasting every dish, adjusting the seasoning, and humming French songs as he worked. The meals he prepared weren't just edible, they were genuinely good, sometimes even better than what the officers had eaten in their own homes before the war. This unexpected kindness extended beyond the kitchen. The Canadian Guards, many of whom had fought alongside Americans in Europe, treated the prisoners with a level of respect that was almost disorienting. They weren't harsh or suspicious. Instead, they chatted quietly, shared jokes, and even taught the Germans a few words of English. For American viewers, this might sound familiar: the idea that decency and discipline can go hand in hand, even in the most challenging circumstances. One day, a young German officer named Weber found himself practicing English with a Canadian corporal. The two men used hand gestures and broken phrases, laughing at their mistakes and learning from each other. Another officer, Strauss, requested access to the camp's small library, hoping to understand how Canada, and by extension the United States, had managed to build such an efficient supply system. Patterson arranged it without hesitation, handing over books on agriculture, industry, and logistics. The most powerful moment came on a rainy afternoon when Corporal Dubois prepared a special meal for the weekend: pork chops with mushroom gravy, scalloped potatoes, and butter tarts for dessert. As the officers sat down to eat, Dubois emerged from the kitchen with a small cake, frosted simply and decorated with a single candle. It was Bergman's birthday, a fact Dubois had learned from a passing comment. The gesture broke every regulation, but it broke something else too: the emotional distance between captor and captive. Bergman, a former Panzer commander, was stunned. He hadn't celebrated his birthday in years, and now, in a Canadian prison camp, he found himself surrounded by fellow officers singing quietly in German, sharing cake and coffee with their guards. For a moment, the war felt far away, replaced by a sense of shared humanity that transcended uniforms and allegiances. For American viewers, these stories resonate deeply. They reflect the values that have long defined the United States and its allies: compassion, fairness, and the belief that even in the darkest times, small acts of kindness can make a world of difference. The guards and cooks at Camp 21 weren't just following orders, they were making a conscious choice to treat their prisoners with dignity, to offer a taste of normalcy in a world turned upside down. This approach had real consequences. The atmosphere in the camp changed. Prisoners volunteered for work details, helped maintain the grounds, and even began to look forward to mealtimes. The rigid hierarchy of the German military softened, replaced by a sense of community that included both prisoners and guards. The officers, once proud and suspicious, now found themselves asking questions, not just about food, but about the society that could produce such abundance and kindness in the midst of war. For the men of Camp 21, these daily interactions became as important as the meals themselves. Every act of respect, every shared joke, every birthday cake was a reminder that the world was bigger than the conflict that had brought them there. And for American viewers, it's a powerful lesson. Sometimes the most effective way to win hearts and minds isn't through force, but through simple, genuine decency. As the weeks went on, the German officers at Camp 21 began to realize that their defeat wasn't just military, it was moral, organizational, and deeply personal. The kindness they experienced in captivity would stay with them for the rest of their lives, shaping the way they saw their former enemies and the world itself. As the days at Camp 21 turned into weeks, something remarkable began to happen. a transformation that went far beyond full stomachs and comfortable beds. For the German officers, the abundance of food was only the beginning. What truly changed them was the slow, steady breakdown of the invisible walls that had separated them from their captors, and even from each other. In a place designed to hold enemies, a new kind of understanding was quietly taking root. At first, the officers clung to their old routines and hierarchies. They sat together at the same tables, spoke only in German, and kept their distance from the Canadian guards. But the daily rhythm of Camp 21, meals served with care, guards who treated them with respect, and the absence of cruelty began to erode those barriers. For American viewers, this echoes the best traditions of the U.S. military, where discipline and humanity are not opposites but partners. The first signs of change were small. A young lieutenant, once gaunt and withdrawn, started asking for seconds at dinner. The guards, instead of refusing, simply smiled and waved him through. Another officer, Weber, began practicing English with a Canadian corporal, determined to learn the language of the nation that had defeated him. Their conversations were awkward at first, a mix of broken phrases and hand gestures, but soon they were sharing stories about their families, their homes, and their dreams for the future. Strauss, the camp's logistics expert, became obsessed with understanding how the Allies had managed such a feat of supply and organization. He requested books on Canadian agriculture, railway construction, and industrial management. Patterson, the camp's commander, provided everything he could find, even arranging for Strauss to study actual supply requisition forms and train schedules. For Strauss, it was a revelation. The efficiency and scale of the Allied system dwarfed anything he had seen in Germany. He realized that the war had been lost not just on the battlefield but in the factories, farms, and railways of North America. The transformation wasn't limited to the officers. The guards, too, began to see their prisoners in a new light. They noticed the changes in the men, their improved health, their willingness to help with camp chores, their growing curiosity about Canadian life. Some guards even started teaching the Germans English words during downtime, turning the mess hall into an impromptu classroom. For American viewers, this spirit of exchange and mutual respect is a reminder of the values that have long defined the United States: openness, generosity, and the belief that even former enemies can become friends. As the weeks passed, the rigid military hierarchy among the prisoners began to soften. Officers who once insisted on strict discipline now found themselves working side by side with younger men, setting tables, stacking chairs, and even helping in the kitchen. The mess hall, once a place of suspicion and silence, became a hub of conversation and laughter. The Germans started to ask real questions, not just about food, but about Canadian society, democracy, and the freedoms that Americans and Canadians alike cherished. One of the most telling moments came when Strauss, the logistics officer, sat down with Patterson to discuss the camp's supply chain. As they pored over train schedules and inventory lists, Strauss admitted that the scale of Allied logistics was beyond anything he had imagined. "We managed supply for entire divisions," he said, "but you move more food to this camp than we could to the front lines." Patterson simply nodded, knowing that the real victory had been won long before the first shot was fired. For American viewers, the story of Camp 21 is a powerful reminder of the strength that comes from openness and adaptability. The United States has always thrived on its ability to learn from others, to welcome new ideas, and to turn former adversaries into allies. At Camp 21, that spirit was alive and well, transforming not just the prisoners but the guards and the entire community. The most profound change, however, was internal. The German officers began to question everything they had been taught about the Allies, about America, and about the nature of power itself. The propaganda that had shaped their worldview crumbled in the face of daily evidence: meals that never ran out, guards who treated them with respect, and a system that worked with quiet, relentless efficiency. By the end of their time at Camp 21, the officers were no longer just prisoners. They were students, learning lessons that would shape the rest of their lives. Some would go on to rebuild Germany using the methods they had observed in Canada and the United States. Others would teach future generations about the importance of questioning assumptions and seeking the truth. And a few would even choose to make North America their new home, drawn by the promise of a society built on abundance, fairness, and opportunity. For American viewers, the legacy of Camp 21 is clear. Real strength lies not just in military might, but in the ability to adapt, to learn, and to treat others with dignity, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The transformation that took place in that remote Canadian camp is a testament to the enduring power of American and Allied values, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are won not with weapons, but with open minds and open hearts. As the weeks at Camp 21 turned into months, the German officers found themselves wrestling with a realization that was more unsettling than any defeat on the battlefield. The truth was inescapable, served up 3 times a day on plates piled high with food that never seemed to run out. For these men, trained to believe in the superiority of their own system, taught to see the Allies as weak and disorganized, the abundance at Camp 21 was a daily reminder that everything they'd been told was wrong. For American viewers, this is where the story hits home. The United States, alongside Canada, had built a war machine not just of tanks and planes, but of farms, factories, and railroads. The real secret weapon wasn't just the Sherman tank or the B-17 bomber. It was the ability to feed millions, to keep supply lines running, and to ensure that every soldier, every prisoner, and every ally had what they needed to keep going. This was the kind of power that couldn't be faked, and it couldn't be matched by propaganda. The German officers began to talk openly among themselves, comparing notes and sharing their growing doubts. Strauss, the logistics expert, was the first to put it into words. He had spent years calculating supply lines, tracking every bullet and loaf of bread, convinced that Allied abundance was a myth. But now, faced with the evidence at Camp 21, he admitted the unthinkable. We underestimated the Americans and Canadians. We believed our own reports, our own propaganda. But the truth is, we never had a chance. Letters home, carefully censored but still revealing, told the same story. One officer wrote to his wife, "The food here is better than anything I ate in the last 2 years of service. Real coffee, real meat, fresh bread. I am ashamed to write this while you and the children go hungry. But it is true, and it teaches me something about why we lost that no battle could teach." For American families who supported the war effort from home, planting victory gardens, working in factories, buying war bonds, these words are a testament to the impact of their sacrifices. The officers' conversations grew more philosophical. They realized that Germany's defeat was not just a matter of lost battles or failed strategies. It was a collapse of the entire system, an inability to sustain the fight, to keep soldiers fed, to maintain the machinery of war. The Allies, by contrast, had built a society that could absorb the shocks of global conflict and still provide for everyone, even their enemies. This realization was both humbling and liberating. For the first time, the German officers could see the bigger picture. They understood that the real strength of the United States and its allies lay not just in military technology, but in the organization, innovation, and sheer scale of their economies. The American way of war was about more than firepower. It was about logistics, planning, and the relentless drive to outproduce and outlast the enemy. For American viewers, this is a point of pride. The victory in World War II was not just won on the beaches of Normandy or the islands of the Pacific. It was won in the wheat fields of Kansas, the factories of Detroit, and the rail yards of Chicago. It was won by ordinary Americans who worked long hours, rationed their own food, and believed in the cause of freedom. The story of Camp 21 is a tribute to that spirit, a reminder that the true measure of a nation's strength is its ability to care for its people, even in the darkest times. The German officers at Camp 21 came to see their captors in a new light. They realized that the kindness and abundance they experienced were not signs of weakness, but of confidence and power. The Allies could afford to be generous because they had built a system that worked. This was the lesson that would stay with the officers long after they left Camp 21, a lesson that would shape their lives, their careers, and even the future of post-war Germany. Some of the officers, like Strauss, became advocates for adopting Allied methods in rebuilding their own country. They wrote papers, gave testimony, and urged their fellow Germans to learn from the American and Canadian example. Others, like Weber, struggled with the emotional weight of what they had discovered, but still passed on the lessons to the next generation. For all of them, the experience at Camp 21 was a turning point, a moment when the myths of the past gave way to the realities of the present. For American viewers, the story of Camp 21 is more than just a footnote in history. It's a powerful reminder of what makes the United States unique. The ability to combine strength with compassion, to turn enemies into friends, and to build a society where abundance is not just a privilege but a responsibility. The deeper realization at Camp 21 was not just about why Germany lost, it was about why America and its allies won. When the gates of Camp 21 finally opened and the German officers were released, the world they returned to was almost unrecognizable. Germany was a nation in ruins, cities flattened, families scattered, and hunger still a daily reality. For many of these former prisoners, the memories of abundance and dignity in a Canadian camp stood in stark contrast to the devastation waiting back home. But what happened next is a story that resonates deeply with American values and the enduring power of second chances. Some officers, like Bergman, returned to find their homes destroyed and their families struggling to survive. Yet instead of being consumed by bitterness, they drew on the lessons learned in captivity. Bergman, who had once commanded tanks across Europe, now found himself starting over with nothing but a few cooking techniques picked up from Corporal Dubois. He began with a humble food cart, serving dishes inspired by both German and Canadian traditions. Over time, his small venture grew into a thriving restaurant, blending schnitzel with maple glaze and apple strudel with butter tarts, a living testament to the unexpected connections forged in Camp 21. For American viewers, this story echoes the classic narrative of reinvention and resilience. It's the same spirit that built the United States, a belief that anyone, given the right opportunity, can start anew and build something better. Bergman's restaurant became more than just a place to eat. It was a gathering spot for people hungry for stories of hope, reconciliation, and the possibility of friendship between former enemies. Other officers took different paths. Strauss, the logistics expert, became obsessed with the Allied supply networks he had witnessed firsthand. After his release, he joined efforts to rebuild Germany's shattered infrastructure, applying Canadian and American efficiency methods to everything from railways to food distribution. He wrote papers, gave lectures, and even testified before military history commissions, insisting that the real lesson of the war was not just about tanks and planes, but about butter, bread, and the power of organized abundance. For some, the transition was harder. Weber, the youngest officer, struggled with depression and a sense of betrayal not by his captors but by the lies he had been taught. He eventually became a schoolteacher, determined to teach the next generation to question propaganda and seek the truth. His memoir, The Education of a Soldier, included a chapter titled The Meals That Taught Me More Than 4 Years of War, a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the most unexpected places. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of Camp 21 was the wave of former prisoners who chose not to return to Germany at all. Over 6,000 German POWs from Canadian camps immigrated to North America after the war, many settling in the United States. They brought with them not just memories of roast beef and apple pie, but a deep appreciation for the values of fairness, opportunity, and community they had experienced in captivity. These men became business owners, teachers, engineers, and neighbors, contributing to the American story in ways that still echo today. For American viewers, this is a powerful testament to the nation's enduring appeal. The United States has always been a land of second chances, a place where even former enemies can find a new beginning. The decision to treat prisoners with dignity and abundance was not just an act of compassion, it was a strategic investment in the future, one that paid dividends for decades in the form of trade, cultural exchange, and even family ties. Bergman's own daughter would eventually marry a Canadian, their children growing up with a foot in both worlds, a living bridge between former adversaries. The lessons of Camp 21 didn't end with the war. They lived on in the choices made by those who experienced it, in the communities they built, and in the stories they passed down to their children and grandchildren. For American families, the story is a reminder that the true measure of victory is not just in the battles won but in the peace that follows. It's about the kind of society we choose to build, one where abundance is shared, where enemies can become friends, and where the legacy of war is transformed into a foundation for lasting peace. Today, the site of Camp 21 is marked by a simple plaque, often overlooked by travelers. But its real legacy is found in the lives it changed, the families it united, and the enduring lesson that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a gun, but a generous plate of food served with dignity. For American viewers, this is more than just history, it's a call to remember the values that define the nation: resilience, generosity, and the belief that even in the darkest times we can choose to build a better world.